but we also need the resolve to resist.
Hey, thanks for watching our live stream. I'm the host, David Krayden. I'll be back in about 10 minutes with the show. In the meantime, have a look at some of these clips and take the opportunity, please, to like this broadcast, ring the bell, or subscribe.
And we're stepping up in every way we can because we know that Russia must win this war. That Ukraine must win this war against Russia.
Go down the list of things that Justin Trudeau disapproves of, and you can imagine all of the things that will be criminalized. That someone who spent the first half of his adult life as a practicing racist, who dressed up in hideous racist costumes so many times he says he can't remember them all, should then be the arbiter on what constitutes hate.
I did not call people who were unvaccinated names.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie about
for everything you did. Thank you to put your life on the line for us. You're one of the greatest women I ever met in my life.
A lot of people would say that you're simply taking a page out of the Donald Trump book.
Like which people would say that?
Well, I'm sure a great many Canadians, but...
Like who?
I don't know who. But
we feel, because you all will have implants, and we measure your brain waves, and I can immediately tell you how the people react, or I can feel how the people react to your answers.
Oh, no, Mr. Bond. I expect you to be chipped.
I'm a liberal and a proud socialist, Mr. Speaker.
This is a Manchurian candidate. For people who don't understand the expression, I'm not talking about the movie. I'm referring to somebody who can be used as a useful idiot by another country to come out and spout these things off. He is a Marxist.
End your silence. Speak up. For God's sake, stop complying. Start rebelling. They're out to get you if you do not resist.
Goodbye, mercy's sake alive. Looks like we got us a convoy.
Canadian country singer Paul Brandt here. I've been listening with my wife and 2 kids, and we want to say thank you for all you're doing in defense of civil liberties and freedom.
I'll ask the question I posed to you at the start of my round. Will you apologize on behalf of the government for this outrageous invite?
And
stand by the invitation.
Of course, what I said in my initial.
You have no shame.
What? Oh my heavens!
There is nothing they fear like the crystal clear sound of someone somewhere telling the truth.
So it will be a world integrating the physical, biological, and digital dimensions. So it will be a new world.
Stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. Because I can tell you, you cannot comply your way out of a tyranny.
Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes.
All of our
I would say it's plain to see that the racket has been going from strength to strength ever since. In his farewell address to the American people in 1961, outgoing President and old soldier Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about the threat posed by what he was already able to identify as the military-industrial complex.
These are all small countries today. They're much like the Greek city-states in the age of the Roman Empire. We're a sort of declining Rome at this point. I hope Americans will figure that out and act against it, but we're a declining Rome. The European states are like the little Greek city-states that were entirely dependent upon Roman military power to save them from the Macedonians. This whole business is a sham. NATO is probably not going to survive.
From the Public Health Agency of Canada did not have the science to support this policy. So the government initiated a study with a guy named David Fisman at the University of Toronto. And this study was so bad, Madam Speaker, that there's a book called Fisman's Fraud, The Rise of Canadian Hate Science. And I just want to know how much money did they spend on these studies to support this arrive scam when they knew that they didn't have the science to even support it from day one?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, the mega conservative far right is coming out. These are the anti, these are the ones that still deny the pandemic. And at the end of the day, thank goodness it was that Canadians and the majority of the people in the House saw the value of protecting the health and well-being of Canadians, and that the far right was marginalized back then, Madam Speaker, because as a direct result, more people are living today.
When did you and your government start to become so afraid of your own citizens?
The Online Harms Act. You heard about it? Well, I've got some bad news for you. It is aimed at your free speech.
Thank God for truckers.
They are so terrified that we, the people, may make what they think is the wrong choice. That in the name of protecting democracy and saving us from ourselves, they're actually destroying our democracy and taking away our freedom.
This is the worst assault on freedom of expression ever in Canadian history.
Donc le but, c'était de faire une pression économique, empêcher de faire.
So the goal was to put economic pressure on these people to stop them from buying groceries, paying into their health insurance, and get them out of the streets.
Not the characterization that I would put on it. The objective was to ensure that those who were funding the continued illegal blockade of this and other cities were no longer able to do so.
Okay. Donc, vous n'avez pas répondu à ma question.
So you didn't answer my first question. In which other democratic country is it possible to do that?
Democratically passed legislation in this country pursuant to the Emergencies Act in Canada.
Okay, donc vous avez fait le droit, là. Vous vous êtes inspiré de la Corée du Nord?
So what, were you inspired by North Korea for this?
No. I'm not going to respond to that type of question, Madam Chair.
No, mais...
He's calling them domestic terrorists and wants to freeze their bank accounts. This has been absolutely outrageous. And everybody now is starting to agree that Justin Trudeau has lost this fight.
There will be consequences.
Justin Trudeau, though, this week said something I hated, which he called out. He said, the world we're starting to see the rise, the growth of authoritarianism and totalitarianism and dictatorships. And I couldn't believe that he said this with a straight face. Listen.
In all of our democracies, in every democracy around the world, we are seeing a rising movements of either authoritarian populism or skepticism about democracy itself. And we all need to recommit ourselves to standing up, not just for Ukraine, but through standing up for Ukraine, to the very principles that make our countries strong and free.
So Justin Trudeau says these comments, he says them with a straight face, as if he doesn't realize what's happening in his own country being led by him to clamp down on freedoms, the authoritarianism that he is presiding over in Canada.
Biden mourned Navalny's death. Even in prison, he was a powerful voice for the truth, he said. An interesting statement while journalist Julian Assange, who published Truth Inconvenient to the US and the West, presently rots in Belmarsh prison as he fights extradition to the US. I'm not yet aware of Biden mentioning, far less lamenting, the death in a Ukrainian prison of US citizen and writer Gonzalo Lira, who was critical of the Zelensky regime. Biden's administration has sought determinedly to jail his and their strongest and most popular opponent, Donald Trump. And yet, in the immediate aftermath of Navalny's death, Biden highlighted Vladimir Putin's desperate attempts to stamp out the opposition. Zelensky, propped up only by Western cash, has crushed his own political opponents as well. The pattern seems clear. Bleat about enemies threatening democracy, while simultaneously and blatantly and hypocritically seeking to trample on democracy at home, or turn a blind eye to the same being carried out by allies, or make that business partners.
Welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. I am your host, David Krayden. And I promised a little bit of commentary, discussion about the Online Harms Act this week. I know you're saying, oh, we've heard so much about it. From me, maybe, but not from the people we need to hear about this from, including the official opposition, more of the media, not just myself and other new media, not just John Carpay of the Justice Center, who's doing a heck of a good job keeping this issue front and center. But we need to hear from the legacy media because, yeah, they're still important for those people who watch the CBC News at night and haven't got a clue this thing is coming. They haven't got a clue. I'm telling you, this is the most underreported, worst bill in history, if it's possible to say that. So what got me started on this morning? And this will be two parts. We can't show everything today. But what I want to do is examine how is the world looking at Canada? What's the global outlook at what Canada is doing with this online harms bill? And I call it the thought crimes bill because that seems to get people's attention. Online harms bill is so ridiculous. It sounds innocuous, almost insouciant, like it's carefree. It's just we're looking after the kids. We're making sure that kids aren't harmed. And of course, that's a veneer to this bill. It is simply the periphery to make it palatable to the public who will say, well, we can't be opposed to something that's protecting children. That's about stopping child pornography. That's about preventing revenge porn. That's about stopping I just about said free speech, stopping hate speech. We already have laws in place for those things. And listen to this clip from Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland when she's asked about last weekend's pro-Hamas protest in Ottawa. A lot of horrible things were said about Israel, about Jews. And she's asked by a CBC reporter about this. And I'll tell you why I'm showing this to you after I'm done.
CBC. Over the weekend, protesters in Ottawa were heard chanting, among other things, "Long live October 7th," and October 7th is proof that we are almost free. Is this hate speech?
I wasn't in Ottawa over the weekend, and I'm not aware of those specific reports, and so it would be just wrong of me to comment on something that I am not specifically aware of. What I will say is today is a time in Canada when anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are on the rise. When we have there are a lot of Canadians who are not feeling safe.
In the first place, the question and the event had nothing to do with Islamophobia. It was about anti-Semitism, and she doesn't seem to get that. In the second place, if you're not in Ottawa over the weekend, Chrystia, you know you can always watch the news, even the news you like CBC, CTV Global. They actually covered this protest fairly well, and it was very well publicized. So you don't have to be in Ottawa to catch up on the news. And apparently she did later that day because she looked pretty stupid not knowing what was happening in Ottawa because she's here for most of her life as the finance minister. And she did apparently watch some video clips and she did come around to condemning it. But what does that tell you? That what happens when we have an online harms bill where people are going to be not only ranting and raving at each other with hate speech, but wanting everybody charged. We're going to fill the jails with people charged with hate speech because we'll have, in this case, we'll have the pro-Israel people accusing the pro-Hamas people of hate speech, and the pro-Hamas people will accuse the pro-Israel people of hate speech, and it'll go back and forth, and nobody will ever learn anything in the process, and we will just have incredible escalation in charges and people potentially going to jail for what they say. But that only proves from what has happened here, because Ottawa police are looking into laying some hate speech charges. So therefore, we already have hate speech laws in place. What do we need an Online Harms Act for? If it's not about silencing free speech entirely, if it's not about jailing people for what they say, and yes, in fact, for jailing people for what they think and what they could potentially say. That's why the Online Harms Act is so odious. It is so nefarious because it attempts to guess what people are thinking and could say. And it's just making an already bad situation worse. And I want to say again, I'm sick to death of these protests because it's all a sham. It's a farce. We've got Antifa, the far left, protesting with these pro-Hamas people who are pretending to be good Muslims and ranting and raving against Israel, but yet they're protesting with Antifa people who don't agree with Muslims on just about anything. We're being played here by the globalists. These protests are just about dividing Canadians, keeping people fighting over things they can't adjudicate, they can't solve. So we don't go after the issues that we can solve, such as gender ideology in the schools. That's why we're having another 1 million-person march in September. We're going to get some religious unity, and we're going to focus on the issues that really do matter. And we're going to stop fighting over this crap, over a foreign war that we have no jurisdiction over in this country. So I want to make that point again, because I'm sick to death of these protests. And I'm sick to death of the antipathy they're causing between people who should be getting along because they really do agree on most basic things. And if these people want to make stupid, horrible, vile statements about Israel, there are already laws in place for that. We don't have to start charging people on the internet for saying offensive things or things that are deemed offensive. Anyway, I wanted to examine how the world is looking at the Online Harms Act, because as I've told you before, when I speak to Americans that I work with at the post-millennial or human events, they thought I was kidding about this bill, that it was that bad, that it was just the conservatives in Canada making it up because this is something Trudeau might do if it was a parody of Justin Trudeau. But no, it's true. And let's listen to how this thing is playing out.
All of our democracies, in every democracy around the world, we are seeing a rising movements of either authoritarian populism or skepticism about democracy itself.
So Justin Trudeau says these comments almost, he says them with a straight face, as if he doesn't realize what's happening in his own country being led by him to clamp down on freedoms, the authoritarianism that he is presiding over in Canada.
There is out there a deliberate undermining of mainstream media. There are the conspiracy theorists, there are the social media drivers who are trying to do everything they can to keep people in their little filter bubbles, to prevent people from actually agreeing on a common set of facts, the way, the CBC and CTV, when they were our only sources of news, used to project.
So before we get to this New York Times piece I want you to have a look at here. Canada wants to regulate online content. Critics say it goes too far. So the New York Times is covering this, and they're saying, whoa, Canada's up to something here. Looks like Justin Trudeau's at it again. Yeah, and here's Trudeau saying, oh, why can't we live in a world? Yes. Why can't we live in that world where we just had the mainstream media? We had 3, maybe 4 networks, and we had maybe 3 national papers, and every major city had a daily or 2. Yeah, we had this Sun chain for those blue-collar conservatives, and the Globe and Mail used to be for those upper-class conservatives, but largely the rest of the media was on the Liberal Party side, on Justin's side. Why can't we go back to those halcyon days? And that's where Justin Trudeau is coming from. And of course, he is a bit mad. He is a bit insane to suggest that we can somehow turn the clock back. So there's no new media, that there's no media on the internet, there's no independent media like the station you're watching now. It's all going to disappear. And that's really what he wants to do, to make it disappear through online legislation or legislation against the online. So let's go back to this here. So when the New York Times raises the red flag, you know there's something going on here. New York Post, a little more conservative than the New York Times.
We're not quite Canada yet. You know, we don't have Pierre Trudeau wanting to put people in prison for life for hate speech. But
close. Just look at our neighbor to the north, Canada. There, free speech is under Cuban-like assault. If the government of leftist Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has its way, not only will your right to write and speak what's on your mind be severely restricted, but also the government can jail you if it suspects you might say something that is unlawful. You heard that right. The mere suspicion that you might mouth or write words or phrases that the government deems to be unlawful is grounds to arrest you. Who could have imagined that what George Orwell labeled thought crimes in his classic novel 1984 about nightmarish life in a totalitarian world would be pursued by Canada of all places?
Now, before we get to Great Britain's response to this, of course, Great Britain has its Online Safety Act, which was the title of Canada's legislation until somebody decided, hey, we better change the name of this because there's been too much publicity about the Online Safety Act being dangerous. So they shifted the focus, not only in the name, but they shifted the focus of the legislation from disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation to hate speech and safety, child safety. They changed the focus to something that people could say, oh, that sounds good. So you look at these clips from the United States. Yeah, the Americans are waking up. There's my old friend Steve Forbes, former Republican presidential candidate. He ran for the Republican nomination at least once, I think maybe twice. Good guy. His media is out there fighting for the right things. And Steve has noticed what's going on in Canada. We always say Americans are very insular. They tend not to look beyond their own borders. Steve Forbes is an exception to that supposed rule. And he's watching very closely because he knows if it can happen in Canada, it can happen in the United States. And if it does happen in Canada, it usually does happen in the United States about 2 or 3, maybe 5 years later. We saw this with things like same-sex marriage, which was at one time unthinkable in the United States. It became law in Canada, and it just sort of migrated across the border. And there's other issues, usually social issues, that this happens with. And Steve Forbes understands the danger of Canada being this social experimentation laboratory where this stuff happens first and it gets exported to the United States. So they didn't want thought crimes. The good thing is, in the United States, they have a constitution that's quite explicit and quite clear about freedom of speech. Our Charter of Rights is not so clear about freedom of speech because it has that huge caveat, that huge disclaimer, that huge exception, which Forbes actually outlines in the longer interview, which says reasonable. There are reasonable restraints. There are reasonable exceptions to free speech in Canada. And that's a danger. So we might be in some trouble there. Let's listen to what they're saying in Great Britain.
Trudeau's crusade against bullying, but his government's online harms bill could turn out to be the most sweeping restriction on freedom of speech that Canada has ever seen. The proposed law, Bill C-63, has provisions to jail Canadians for certain speech crimes. Anyone who advocates for genocide can face life imprisonment, the same penalty as murder. You can even be prosecuted for things that you haven't said. A judge can impose fines and even issue a house arrest warrant if they believe that there are grounds to suspect that someone will commit an offence. Author Margaret Atwood slammed the bill as Orwellian on X, writing, The possibilities for revenge false accusations plus thought crime stuff are so inviting. Trudeau's Orwellian online harms bill. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal columnist Michael Taub has compared the bill to the film Minority Report. But according to the National Post, 70% of Canadians back action to make online platforms safer, but only 41% believe that this bill will be successful. And I think that the bill kind of, it's big enough that you look at one part of it and you think that's a great initiative, and then you look at the other part in the fine lines and you say, okay, that's a little bit much. But I want to get into this part where a judge can put you, under house arrest for things that they think that you might say. Now that is a can of worms. How are they going to manage that?
Well, they're not, are they? I mean, short answer, it's impossible. But it opens up, as you say, a can of worms. I mean, how you begin to even deliberate on something like this. It seems like a very fundamental change of law that if they were going to go into in that kind of direction, you would hope that there would be some kind of proper public debate on it, because it really is setting a brand new precedent. It shouldn't be something that is smuggled into a very large, and actually I had a read of the bill myself, and what I found quite remarkable was that, kind of as you were saying there were lots of very innocuous, very sensible sounding bits, and then often kind of buried in quite boring legalistic language were things that you had to read them twice and be like, oh my God, they surely not. It's not the time to be bringing in some sweeping change of precedent into the legal system. And
now, before we continue here, you can see that there's a careful dawning on the media in Great Britain that this is something very special, if you will, very unique to Canada. And it's probably the most repressive legislation against free speech in the world, at least for a democratic country, or a country that's supposedly still democratic. Let's listen to some more, and we will round out our coverage of how Great Britain is viewing this. This is a point that John Carpay makes all the time about, ultimately, this bill is supposed to be about protecting children. That's what as I said, that's the veneer of this bill. And this is how the Liberals are selling it. But as Russell Brand and John Carpay have both said, that's your responsibility about what your children are watching. What is the state doing interfering in the internet activity of your family? But they want to insert themselves into everything you say or do, clearly.
I think now that we're increasingly finding ourselves in the grip of that narrow group of people who would rather that none of that disagreement and discussion and debate was happening. Mm-hmm. They just want to hear everyone say, and they want to think and be persuaded that everyone thinks the way that they do.
Just a quick interjection here. This, of course, is my good friend Neil Oliver, who was on my show recently, specifically to discuss the Online Harms Act, vis-a-vis what they have produced in Scotland, which is a hate speech bill, which has caused chaos in that country, as people have been charging each other and counter charges, and it is absolute lunacy. But Neil is a fighter for free speech. He's out there every day expressing his opinion on this, and we need fighters like him. So it was so grateful to have him on the show.
And it's existential. It's an existential crisis, and that's what's underpinning all this bit about coming up with a term of words like stirring up hatred. It's absolute nonsense.
So that ends our first look at the global perspective on the Online Harms Bill. And it's worrisome, to say the least. People are looking at Canada either as a laughingstock, as a place that has deserted, has forfeited its democratic rights, or as a very dangerous place where George Orwell is not a warning, but a plan. This is something conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said when he was addressing the Canada Strong and Free conference about 2 weeks ago. And thank God he finally opened his mouth about this bill and was clear and explicit in his opposition to it. He needs to do that every day, or at least once a week. But I was glad to see him do that before that audience, which, believe me, is by no means necessarily an audience that is actually that conservative or libertarian, and that is actually that attuned to free speech. And we'll learn a bit more about that tomorrow. Where is the opposition coming from in Canada to this bill, and where is it not coming from? And how weak is some of the conservative opposition to it? We'll examine that tomorrow. But thanks for joining me today. I encourage you to support this station. Please like, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't. And you might need to resubscribe because, it does happen all the time. And I would add again, we just got these wonderful magnets. And yes, you can get them at the store. And I showed you the coffee cup yesterday. We're getting another size of that. That's available. We have the hoodies and we have the t-shirts, Resolve to Resist t-shirts, the Stand on Guard t-shirts, and Think While It's Still Legal. Couldn't be a more relevant t-shirt to be wearing this year as we're on the precipice of possibly losing our free speech. Let's keep fighting. Let's resolve to resist. Let's fight back. Let's keep getting people educated about this bill and how dangerous it is. Thanks for watching today. I will be back again tomorrow with more about the online harms bill. Thank you.